Hello, class. Today we're reading and discussing Tom Hill's article, Ideals of Human Excellence and Preserving Natural Environments. So one of the first things we want to get clear on here is something that can be a bit of a linguistic ambiguity, and it's really important that you keep these terms distinct in your mind. What I have in mind here is the distinction between rights and doing what is right. So rights, plural, or at least something that can be plural, these are moral permissions. Right? If you have a right to do something, then morally speaking, no one has a right to stop you, and people might even have a duty not to try to stop you, and they might even have a duty to try to contribute to your success. So when Regan talks about animals having rights, this is the kind of thing he's talking about, right? When he says animals have rights not to be killed, he means other people have duties not to kill them. If we were to say, I think Regan is in the camp where he would say wolves, unlike humans, have a right to kill rabbits, then he's saying, given that they have this sort of moral permission to kill rabbits, then no one else should be interfering with whether they do or not. Right? So this is an issue that comes up with environmentalists when it comes to whether or not we should reintroduce predatory species to habitats that they once inhabited but have, or at least at some point, stopped being present. So like reintroducing wolves to Yellowstone Park. Some animal rights advocates think that the right thing to do, and that's going to be our other use of right, is to bring wolves back to Yellowstone if we can, because that's natural habitat of theirs. Others think that we would actually be violating the rights, plural, of herbivores in that environment, given that we would be introducing animals that would hunt and kill them. So rights, something that at least can be plural, doesn't have to be, right? We can talk about a right to do something, but creatures can have rights. That's distinct from doing the right thing. Here, right is an adjective, not a noun. So it doesn't, you can't turn it into a plural, right? You can't say something is the rights thing to do, and that's just not good English. The reason we want to really draw this distinction here is just because you have a right to do something does not mean it is the right thing to do. And we're going to be going back and forth between talking about rights, the noun that can be plural, and the right thing that is the adjective. So to try and give an example to hopefully help make this distinction clearer, let's say that I'm on the bus and I'm not sitting up in the front seats of the bus that specifically say they're reserved for elderly and disabled people. You know, I'm a ways back on the bus and there's only one free seat left on the bus, and it's the one next to me. And this elderly couple gets on the bus and they come up and one of them says, you know, we would really like to sit together. Would you mind giving up your seat so that the two of us could sit side by side here? Well, I have a right to say no in that circumstance. So hopefully that seems right to you, that I'm not sitting in the seats that are reserved for elderly people, so I have a right to say, no, I was here first. That doesn't mean it would be the right thing to do. It could in fact be the wrong thing to do. It could be morally wrong of me not to be willing to give up my seat, though I have a right to do so. And so no one could, you know, drag me out of the seat or start screaming at me for refusing to give it up. So hopefully this is clear, right? I can have a right to keep the seat, but it would not be the right thing to do. I ought to give it up. Now, my reason for focusing on this is that in most of his work, Tom Hill is interested in rights, that is, moral permissions or things that can generate duties in others. Right? So if I have a right to something, you have a duty not to interfere with my getting it, and you might even have a duty to help me get it. But in this work, he's not interested in rights at all. He's interested in what sort of person does what is right, the right thing to do with respect to nature, regardless of what rights they have. So specifically what we're going to see him arguing about is the fact that you could have a right to do something that is detrimental to nature, but it would not be the right thing to do. And while no one would have the standing to stop you from doing what you have a right to do, we could still kind of judge you to be morally defective for not doing the right thing with respect to nature. Okay, now to get us motivated to move towards this understanding, Hill wants to say, look, there's plenty of pragmatic and aesthetic reasons to find acts of environmental degradation unpleasant or unwise. Right? We just tend to be the kind of creatures that if you show us a pristine mountain untouched by human intervention, and then you show us another picture of that same mountain after the top's been leveled off by strip mining, and there's gray brown smoke and all kinds of damage to the land, we tend to find that aesthetically ugly. So that's some kind of reason not to do strip mining. But it's not a moral reason. It's that it becomes aesthetically unpleasant. Or there's pragmatic reasons to find environmental degradation unwise. Most of us, I assume, are aware of the fact that overall, the temperature of the Earth is climbing at a rate that is unsustainable, and the amount of ice melting and the rising levels of the oceans are going to cause catastrophic badness for humans all over the world in the next 100 years or so. That's really good pragmatic reason to do something about global warming and about human contributions to it. But that doesn't necessarily have to be moral. It could just be, if you could be thinking, well, crap, if I don't do something about global warming and rising sea levels, all of that beachfront property that I own all over the coastal areas of the United States are going to be underwater, and I'll lose tens of millions of dollars worth of property. And that's why I care that ocean levels are rising. That's a perfectly good pragmatic reason, right? You're just sort of looking out for what's prudent. But Hill wants to say, look, is that, or are these two things all there is to our tendency to think of at least some acts of environmental degradation as really bad? And Hill thinks the answer is no. There's more to it. There's more to our negative feelings than just a sense that this is unwise or aesthetically unpleasant. So even if we granted someone that they have done a proper and effective cost-benefit analysis showing that degradation of the environment is a net positive, right? So we say, look, if you take into account all of the various things of, say, monetary value that will be lost versus the amount of monetary value that will be gained, and you even factor in the aesthetic costs of environmental degradation and you offset those with some kind of gain, even if your cost benefit analysis covers all of that and it says on net, the environmental degradation will have a positive value. Let's take that as given for a second. And let's also take for a second that the person who's done this cost benefit analysis is someone who has a right to engage in this environmental degradation. So let's suppose that we took property rights really, really seriously. And this person said, look, I own this 10,000 acres of woodland. Nobody has a right to tell me that I can't just strip it bare of all of the wood because I want the profit. So they've shown that it's pragmatically intelligent of them to commit this act of environmental degradation, and we suppose that they have a right to do it. Should we then feel that it's just morally indifferent whether they engage in this environmental destruction or not? Hill thinks the answer is no. There's another basis for our having these negative feelings towards people, even when they're not imprudent and they're exercising something that they have a right to do. Now, Hill considers and rejects several proposals for making sense of why these acts of environmental degradation might be morally wrong, and he finds them all at best inconclusive. So I'm not going to worry about us going through those one by one. I'll just say that when he looks at why acts of degradation, environmental degradation might be wrong, he thinks they're either they're actually okay, or at least it's inconclusive. So he says, let's take a different approach. Instead of focusing on acts, let's focus on agents, that is, the people performing the acts. So here the question becomes not what act ought I to do, or what act do I have a right to do? The question becomes, what sort of person would want to do things like that? And in the case of environmental degradation, he suggests the answer is people lacking certain traits that we take to be important and morally worthwhile. So it'll turn out on Hill's picture that someone might do something that is prudent and that they have a moral right to do, but it still shows that they are lacking certain traits as a person that we find praiseworthy and sort of morally important or worthwhile. So here's an example of agent assessment. It's a rather macabre example, but suppose I have available to me some human skin that has been tanned into leather. I am in no way responsible for the person dying or for their skin having been made into leather, right? I do not have any responsibility for that happening. It's already happened, but now I have the opportunity, let's say, to purchase it and do something with it. Let's also say this person who died and their skin was turned into leather, they have no family, nobody else who might have a right to be given their remains. Nobody cares that they're gone, essentially. And in this context where I'm not responsible for doing anything morally wrong in bringing about this person's death, nobody else has a right to ownership of the skin. So I decide that I'm going to buy it and make a lampshade out of it. Well, it seems like no rights have been violated, right? There's no surviving family that could say, hey, the remains of our family member belong to us. But still, most of us would find this really morally repugnant. What kind of person would think, well, given that it's available, I'd like to buy this human skin and turn it into a lampshade? We think there's something deeply wrong with the character of someone who would say, that's what I want to use this human skin for. Of course, if you're heavy into animal rights, you might think there's not very much difference between this and wanting a lampshade made out of any other kind of leather. But even assuming, or just to make sure that we're appealing to the anthropocentrists that might be listening, let's say, this is human leather that we're talking about. And I think we do find that most everybody would find this really morally repugnant. And Hill says that's because we think there's something wrong with being the kind of person that would say, yeah, this is a good use of the skin of a formerly living human being. So if we've got this idea of agent assessment as distinct from the assessment of actions, then we can ask, what sort of person would engage in environmental degradation? Now, to focus on what Hill really wants to focus on, let's set aside for our purposes two kinds of people. First, let's set aside people who are unwise. That is, they make bad cost-benefit analyses. So we're not worrying about assessing the character of people that make imprudent decisions, right? They would have made more money if they left the forest alone and instead they cut it down. We're not worried about them. And let's also set aside people who fail to love nature for itself. Right? He says this is a case we want to, or this is the case we want to explain. So we can't just cite that as the explanation for our reaction, right? So presumably people who are willing to engage in environmental degradation, they are people who fail to love nature for itself. But you don't explain what kind of person they are by saying, oh, well, they fail to love nature. That's the thing we want to explain, so we can't use it as the explanation. So setting those aside, we can ask, who is it that makes us uncomfortable and gives us the intuition that they're missing something important with respect to how they value nature? Well, a little bit of background here. Tom Hill is a Kantian. So he thinks, as I said earlier, that rights are the core and maybe even the entirety of morality. As a Kantian, Hill thinks that the only moral virtues, strictly speaking, are those that directly tie to whether you are the sort of person to respect other people's rights and do what you have a duty to do. So this prevents him from making moral criticism of the agential character of the person who engages in environmental degradation, or for that matter, the kind of person who would use human leather to make a lampshade, right? As long as you respect the rights of others and you do what you have a moral duty to do, and as long as you're the kind of person who consistently makes those kinds of choices, he's going to say, look, you're fine as far as moral virtue goes. However, there are non-moral virtues, there are non-moral character traits that strongly tend to go with being morally virtuous or vicious. And he thinks people who engage in environmental degradation often strike us as people lacking those character traits. So strictly speaking, the character traits that we're going to be looking for are not themselves moral virtues, but they're things that correlate with moral virtues. And he thinks that it's lacking those other non-moral character traits that is what usually worries us or we find disturbing about a person if we find that they lack these traits, and we find that people who are just fine with environmental degradation often lack these traits. So one character trait that Hill thinks it correlates strongly with being the kind of person who goes in for environmental degradation is a lack of appreciation of one's own place in nature. So the person who is sort of the anti-environmentalist, right? They may strike us as not appreciating the scale of the place in the grand history of nature of an individual human or humanity as a whole. And we're not talking about just lacking knowledge of facts about how old the earth is and how, relatively speaking, human beings as a species have not been around for a very long time. They may lack that knowledge or they may not. What we are talking about when we say that they fail to appreciate the scale of the grand history of nature is that they lack a proper perspective on what all of that means and why it's important, why you ought to see human beings as kind of small and fragile and part of this grand history that stretches far, far, far back before we were ever on the scene. And there's at least a good chance will stretch far, far into the future after we're all gone, assuming that we don't make choices that make the entire planet uninhabitable. So ultimately, Hill suggests this thought that anti-environmentalists lack an appreciation of their place in nature. He thinks this ties to a suspicion that such a person lacks an important kind of humility. Now, when we say that they lack humility, he says this isn't the same as selfishness. Right? A selfish person is someone who is inclined to disrespect the rights of others and take what is not theirs. The kind of lack of humility that Hill wants to talk about is being the sort of person that has a certain attitude, namely, they seem to think that everything should be measured with respect to themselves, or at most a small group of similar people. So this is someone who just kind of sees themselves as the center of everything important. And they may be still willing to recognize and respect the moral rights of other people, but they still kind of think that other people just aren't that important as compared to themselves. Now, again, here, so the way Hill has set things up, we can't accuse this person of necessarily lacking moral virtue. As I just said, they may still respect the rights of everyone and everything that actually has rights, and they don't think that they are special in terms of what rights they have. But he thinks this person who kind of puts themselves at the center of their assessment of everything, it seems very probable that a person like that, who still recognizes and respects the rights of everyone else, is going to be psychologically rare. Most people who lack this non-moral humility, most people who tend to see themselves as the center of the universe, they also usually lack the moral readiness to respect the rights of others and take the interests of others into account. So their non-moral failing of tending to see themselves as the center of the universe correlates strongly with a moral failing, namely not respecting the rights of others, which is a genuinely moral issue, according to Hill. So to apply this to the issue of nature and environmental degradation, he says, look, someone who views all of nature as a mere resource to be used seems unlikely to avoid a morally objectionable sense of self-importance. That is, it becomes unlikely that they are the sort of person who really takes your rights as seriously as they take their own. And there's another aspect of non-moral humility that relates to environmentalism. So this form of arrogance just discussed was about the probability of properly recognizing your own importance relative to that of others. We can also say that there's a kind of arrogance that is, to quote Hill here, a matter of understanding, facing squarely, and responding appropriately to who and what one is. And by that, he means you are a fallible, mortal, really rather fragile being made out of flesh and blood. So you are the kind of creature that can make mistakes, is going to grow old and die. And if you don't grow old and die, it'll be because your rather fragile flesh and blood makeup is prematurely destroyed or decimated or something like that. Why is it arrogance to fail to recognize and face squarely those facts of the human condition? Well, Hill says we see this sort of arrogance in people, for instance, who desperately try to hide the fact that they're aging, right? That use all kinds of plastic surgery and Botox and other ways of artificially sculpting their bodies to look youthful. Now, there could be all sorts of reasons that someone does that, and not all of them have to do with arrogance. But one plausible candidate for why someone would do that is that they are a person who is hiding really from themselves, and they're failing to own the fact that they are the sort of thing to grow old and eventually to die. So in a word, for Hill, they lack self-acceptance. I can just tell you, personal anecdote wise, this sort of happened to me just very recently. I went from high school to undergrad to grad school in a sort of seamless transition. So I never really noticed myself as getting particularly older. I was always a college student. And then I finished grad school and got a full-time teaching job. And all of a sudden, all of my students seemed a lot younger and I seemed a lot older. And I sort of just had this realization of, wow, I guess I was aging the whole time. And now here I find myself around the age of 40 when I just, 2 years ago, I didn't really think of myself as all that different from someone who was 24 or whatever. I was kind of missing something missing something factual, but also maybe having a kind of willful blindness to the fact that I was getting older. So in Hill's terms, I was lacking self-acceptance. I was refusing to face up to the fact that, this old body is just ticking along, getting a little bit older every day. And I had really left young adulthood behind a while ago and entered adulthood. Maybe I still haven't quite reached middle age, quote unquote, but if not, I'm close. So the fact that we live, we grow up, we decline, and then we die, these are in themselves morally neutral facts, at least according to Hill. But these are still facts that people desperately hide from. They make a lot of people deeply uncomfortable. And so one important thing that environmentalists focus on is that it seems people who systematically prefer an artificial world of concrete and steel over the natural world of plants and animals, that is, creatures that also live and die, these are often, not always, but often, people who have failed to achieve recognition of and peace with the facts about the nature of human mortality. So people who find decomposing animals out in the forest or rotting wood with grubs underneath really, really disgusting, may have a kind of visceral hatred of anything that reminds them of their own mortality and their own physical nature. That's why they prefer things of steel and concrete that, even though buildings are often not designed to last forever anymore, they seem like they are at the time. They're shiny and gleaming, and they seem ageless. Now, let me be clear here. I'm not suggesting that maybe you have this kind of arrogance if you don't like to roll around in the forest floor with decomposing animal bodies and grubs and earthworms, right? That would be a weird view for me to be offering. But the idea is just that if you're deeply uncomfortable with any reminder of the fact that mortal things are mortal, that they eventually die and decompose, that might be evidence that you are failing to face up to the kind of creature you are, a mortal, fallible, fragile creature. And that, we might think, correlates strongly again with a sort of anti-environmentalist sentiment. These are going to be people who don't recognize the value of the environment and think that, in principle, maybe the whole planet would be better off if it was just turned into chrome and steel and concrete, and we got rid of all of that organic stuff that ends up turning into rot. So to conclude here, Hill wants to walk a careful line. Because he's got these Kantian philosophical commitments to a view of morality that makes all of morality about respecting rights and discharging your duties, he can't say that these failures of humility or self-acceptance are moral failings, unless we define them in terms of refusing to respect rights and refusing to do one's duty. And he's specifically not done that. So what he wants to do is simply say, we should ask ourselves what kind of person we want to encourage people to be, not for its own morality, but with an eye to its connection to morality. And this, I think, is the character or agent equivalent of the person who says, well, you don't want to be the sort of person who whips a horse or kicks a dog because it makes you more likely to be the kind of person that will hit a human being. And human beings have rights not to be treated that way. Right? So this would be the non-animal rights person who tries to explain why we have any obligation to animals at all in terms of our obligations to human beings. And famously, this is what Kant himself said. He said, the only reason that you have a moral obligation not to go around kicking non-human animals is that it makes you more likely to be the kind of person who would go around kicking human beings. And human beings are the kind of thing that matter morally. I think Hill is trying to do something similar, saying, look, there are certain character traits that make you the kind of person who reliably disrespects other people's rights or fails to do their duty. Those are moral failings. And those don't have anything to do with environmentalism, strictly speaking. But there's these other failings that are not moral failings themselves, but they correlate to moral failings. And that's what he really wants us to emphasize and see, so that we can keep morality as a matter of rights and duties, but still have something to say about the anti-environmentalist sort of person. Now, as we're going to see shortly with some of our other readings and lectures, there are other moral views that do not tie all of morality to rights and duties. And so these are going to allow us to make a more, quote unquote, full-throated assertion that lacking the kind of character traits that Hill is talking about regarding nature, these other views are going to be able to say those are moral failings. They're not just correlated with moral failings, they're moral failings themselves. Hill can't do that, but we're going to see that people who are more inspired by Aristotle than Kant can say that there's something just directly morally screwed up with a person who doesn't recognize anything in nature that's worth revering or having a sort of moral attitude towards. Okay, so that'll finish our discussion of Hill, and we will move on to our next reading and move on to, excuse me here. And we'll move on to our next reading and our next lecture, where we will be looking at some non-Kantians. So thank you.